I'm really looking forward to hearing from Stephen Aguilar. Stephen's an assistant professor of education in the educational psychology concentration at the USC Rossier School of Education. Stephen, I can't wait to see your artwork.
All right, sounds good.
Can we just add? I know we didn't go into detail in these introductions, but he's also I believe the associate director of a new research center on AI there, which he can tell us about.
Yeah. So very briefly, I'm the associate director for the new USC Center for Generative AI in Society. So we're thinking, like everyone else, deeply about these issues and how we can sort of approach generative AI in education. So I'm looking for a place to share my screen. I don't see it yet. It's up top. Somewhere.
Should be.
There it is.
It might be at the bottom on yours. Sorry.
It's usually at the bottom, but let me just see if I can. It's grayed out when I see it, so let me.
Was he listed?
There we go. I figured it out.
Okay, because otherwise we've got your slides and can do it too.
No, sorry about that. You think I would know better by now, but I don't. So the title of my talk is becoming a tempered optimist in the age of generative AI in education. And throughout the talk, I'll just have the prompts I use to create the images here in case you want to look for some Easter eggs or just see what the text that generated these images. But first, before I get started, I want to level set, right? And when I say that, I want to reference the Gartner hype cycle for emerging technology. So a number of you are probably familiar with it, right? When there's a tech trigger, it gets a lot of visibility, and over time, there's a lot of excitement. There's a trough of disillusionment, slope of enlightenment. And by my estimation, we're still super excited about what generative AI can do, but I feel like we're still potentially a little overly optimistic in terms of what it can do and what it's for. So when I say let's level set, I mean let's basically become tempered optimists and close this gap between having inflated expectations and finding this plateau of productivity, right? So the way I define tempered optimism is you're excited about the possibilities that new technologies offer, but you know that things can go wrong. You know that they will go wrong. Unexpected things will happen until real use cases are established and proven, right? And the talks up to this point started to get at some of that. You saw a lot of empirical work that start to ask really important questions about how generative AI, ChatGPT in particular, could be used in educational settings. So I encourage all of you to think about how do you become a tempered optimist. But I'm also going to give you some tools to get there, right? Specifically, there are 4 things that I think everyone ought to think about when we're thinking about emerging technologies in education. The first is to take a historical view, right? And that allows you to set realistic expectations when there's a new technology trigger. Second, it's important to know when technologies become ready to hand, right? This is an awkward term. It's not mine. It's actually a philosophical term by Martin Heidegger. So it's translated German, which is why there are all the hyphens. I'll explain what that means when I get there. It's also important to examine and understand the perceived affordances of new technologies, right? What do new technologies suggest they can do? And finally, one ought to be mindful of the socio-technical system where any given technology operates, right? What's happening? And all these terms in red I'm going to define throughout this talk, so you'll have some tools to really understand what to do when there's a new tech trigger and really kind of how to understand generative AI. So first, let's take a historical view of technology, but ed tech really. Let's go back, right, on writing. So writing can be sort of, you can stretch it and see it's as a technology for education, but Socrates hated it, right? Writing will introduce forgetfulness. Folks who write won't practice using their memory. For the most part, folks who focus on writing won't be properly taught. They'll know nothing, right? So, this first long established sort of human artifact or human technology of writing was seen by one of what we consider a great thinker to be not amazing, not super great, right? And we can see that we write all the time, and that's not, a lot of these things aren't necessarily true. Interestingly, Midjourney gave him 2 hands, so I think that's just kind of amusing, right? Like you can imagine Socrates trying to use 2 pens that someone gave him and being super confused about it, which is why he hated it. That's sort of the narrative that I created in my head around this image. Let's move on to books, right? Okay, we know that writing's good. What about books? We generally see books as being really good things that sort of capture human knowledge and allow us to share it sort of at scale. But when we look back around the 1500s, Conrad Gessner, who's active during the 1500s, he's sort of the father of bibliography. He went around and wanted to understand, what was out there. He roughly found 300 books, and this was back when you had to travel, go to libraries and find books. He thought there were too many, right? So to the fact where he said that the multitude of books which grows every day in a prodigious fashion will make the following centuries fall into a state as barbarous as that of centuries that followed the fall of the Roman Empire, right? So again, we see sort of another sort of back then emerging technology through the printing press and a reaction to it, a strong reaction to it, saying that books are overwhelming. And maybe we ought to think about what we need to keep and what we need to leave in oblivion, right, to use his words. We sort of fast forward a little bit and we look at the gramophone or music. Article written in Gramophone in 1936 said that children developed the habit of dividing attention between the humdrum preparation for the school assignments and the compelling excitement of the loudspeaker, right? So again, there's this reaction to sort of a new and emerging and technology that's growing in ubiquity and how it might not be great. Fast forward to the 1950s in television, where this person known as Ernest, which is just an amazing name, said that Americans tend to assume that any problem can be solved by a new pill, serum, or ingenious gadget. Thus, the closed circuit television for the classroom has been seized upon by the most hopeful solution for the expected shortage of teachers. Right, again, you see another technology, and we can begin to draw these parallels between an emerging technology that is now established, but back then it was emerging, and how there's this potential optimism, but one that hasn't been tempered yet, one that's potentially overly optimistic. We can sort of not look back not too far and look at iPads and how, there was a large investment here in Los Angeles, but there wasn't a lot of planning around what they were for, right? There was a lack of resources, inadequate planning in terms of what they're for, how they would be used, how they would be evaluated. Students were were clever and jailbroke a lot of the iPads. So there's a pattern of this technology trigger and different reactions to it that can feel a little bit disoriented, right? It's either super positive, super negative, but generally things happen to be in the middle. So, the too long didn't read version of this is that we're often not very good about predicting exactly how good or bad a specific technology will be for education. But that's okay, right? So the point of my talk isn't that we need to be good at predicting what technology will be good for. It's rather that we need to study the emerging technologies as they come so that we can make better decisions, right? And the talks proceeding up to this point were folks doing that, right? And I want us to encourage to keep doing that as we begin to examine and to use Dean Moji's words, interrogate the new technologies that emerge and who they're for and who they serve. So shifting a little bit, when I say that a technology is at hand, I'm actually there's a distinction that's important to understand here. When you think of a tool that's ready to hand, think of any tool, any human artifact that you know how to use without thinking. You just pick it up and you use it. It could be a pen, it could be your car that you drive. It has just become embedded in your practice versus a tool that's present at hand, which you can't use it because it's broken or because you don't know what it is, right? So we can see the parallel here between just this hammer and ChatGPT, where some folks are more facile with it, whereas other folks don't quite know what it is, right? And Tim Brodsky earlier said that that he sees teachers that are like, I'm excited, but I'm not quite sure what this is for yet. But we want tools to move towards being ready to hand, because once we know how to use the tool well and we're facile with it, we can be very productive. And that's sort of where we want to move when there's a new and emerging tool. So I'll take a pause here and show you what I consider a tool to be present at hand. So any guesses as to what this thing is on the screen? Feel free to use the chat. A couple of you might know, but I did not. Golf club. Okay, I could see that. Don't know what a GAM is, so you're already using a thing I don't know. But it's a butter paddle, right? So I didn't know what a butter paddle was, and I learned what it was for, right? You use it with a giant copper pedal to constantly stir apple butter over a fire so that it doesn't burn. Now, what's interesting is that the guesses, you still, and I'll get to this in a few minutes, you still had pretty good guesses. You saw the handle. Golf club is a pretty good approximate, it kind of looks like one. And there's a reason that you could say that, right? But now that you know what it is, chances are you could probably use it, right? So I've shifted for you. This tool became ready to hand now. Now, who knows if you'll use it perfectly, but it's still, you know how to use it technically. Which gets me to this idea of perceived affordances, right? So chances are we've all been in a situation where we approach a door and it might have a flat panel or a pull handle. This design feature of the door suggests its use, right? So going back to the paddle here, when someone said golf club or hoe, you were interpreting the design of this object to suggest its use, right? It has a perceived affordance. So when we're thinking about perceived affordances, when they're incorrect, right? So when you see a failure of a perceived affordance, there's this sort of interruption of what you think it's for, right? So here's a door in Ann Arbor where they had to put up a sign that says this door does not open the way that you think it does, unless you think it's a push door, right? So there's a disconnect between the designed object, your expectations of it, and its function. So it's important to, when you're looking at any new emerging technologies, to begin to understand what is potential perceived affordances for. And I'll have some guesses as to, or more some educated guesses as to what we can use ChatGPT for. And I want to push all of you to really think about the perceived affordances of all learning technologies. They're there, but they're complex and they're often embedded in other technologies, right? So I have like a laptop on the screen here with 3 different functions, right? Someone's writing a paper. We're all on Zoom right now looking, and someone else is doing some analysis at the bottom, right? The computer might not necessarily suggest easily all these affordances. You have to actually have to look at the software, right? And this is when we begin to sort of think about human artifacts as also being digital artifacts, not simply physical ones. And digital artifacts also have perceived affordances that we need to examine in order to really have a sense of how they're used, what they're for, and what we can do with them. And begin to basically play. But in order to do that, we also need to think about the socio-technical system where these emerging technologies occur, right? So I like to think of the socio-technical system as sort of this 3-legged stool that has a technology, a context, and the people that are inhabiting both of those things, using the technology or within that context. And specifically, I'll use an example here to illustrate. So this is my favorite example. Those of you who know me might have heard me talk about it before. But if we think about a device, a technology, we can think about a car, a road, and the person driving the vehicle, right? In order for you to have a positive driving experience, you need to know how to drive a car. You need to know, or you need to be on a pretty good road. And you need to be able to drive it, right? Good car, good road, you need to know how to drive it. And we can see when any one of these things breaks down, that the others don't matter as much, right? If you have perfect roads, but are driving a car that is not safe to drive or does not drive well, the fact that you can drive it really well might mitigate or might sort of make the positive not super terrible, but it's still not going to be a good experience. If you're driving on really poor roads, again, it's not going to be a good experience. So when we think about emerging technologies and what they're for, it's important for us to think about the objects, the contexts, and the people. Because when we ignore one of these 3 features, again, going back to my 3-legged stool, the whole thing can topple, right? And often when we see sort of technologies fail, it's because the folk that want to implement that technology or adopters of that technology sort of ignored one of these sort of legs of the stool, if you will. You know, they didn't provide teachers with enough training to use the new technology, or the school, going back to the pandemic when we moved to emergency distance learning, there wasn't the infrastructure to actually move to remote learning in a way that allowed students without access to broadband access it, right? So some of my work a couple of years ago examined this very phenomenon in terms of schools not, you know, people being under-resourced, right? Maybe we have Wi-Fi, but it's not broadband, so I'm not going to be an active participant in remote learning. Or maybe the computer I have, it's one that we share. It's not super powerful, but you know, you can begin to fix that by providing laptops with the district providing laptops. But again, it's important when we're thinking about the emergence of ChatGPT as sort of this next emergent technology to think closely about these three pillars. So what's sort of the point of all this? So I want to sort of bring it back to thinking about generative AI and education specifically. So if we take a historical view, going back to how I began this talk, a historical view suggests that generative AI within education will have effects. It will make a difference, right? But those effects might be modest. They might be uneven, right? We can think about some students being able to take advantage of this, whereas other students do not. Some of the talks today sort of got into that. Schools probably won't fundamentally change forever, right? They'll change a little bit, right? But the practice of learning and the practice of learning together won't sort of become this drastic shift that I've heard sort of anecdotally a few folks are expecting. Generative AI is currently, depending on who you talk to and in which circles, currently what I would consider present at hand as use cases emerge, right? There are a number of folks that don't quite know what to do with it, or it's in this space where going to sort of linking back to David Yeager's talk, right? If you use sort of a big, expansive, large language model that can quote unquote do everything, it can't actually do very specific things very well, right? So that's a tool that is not necessarily ready to be used. And we can see, and a lot of work is pushing towards more specificity so that it can be more responsive to specific use cases. What are the perceived affordances of generative AI and ChatGPT and tools like that? We've heard a lot about that already today, right? It can accelerate workflow, it can personalize, it can become an ideation partner. It can become a barrier reducer, right? The last question before I started talking, folks were saying, well, it could help you learn how to code. It could be a research tool to parcel out large corpuses of data, right? There are a lot of potential perceived affordances of generative AI. But it's important to think of it that way, right? What can this new technology help me do? And what does its use suggest? And that will necessarily be an interaction between sort of the specific iterations of generative AI and the use cases or sort of the translation layer that's put on top of a large language model. But we also, again, sort of need to think about the socio-technical system that supports or ideally supports generative AI, right? So what tools currently exist? What are the technologies, right? Well, there's ChatGPT, there's the vanilla version that everyone might have access to. There's specific iterations that a number of businesses are sort of adapting to their own needs. I was at, for educators in the room, I was at ISTE in Philadelphia a few weeks ago, and there was, you know, partnership between OpenAI and AT&T because they wanted their workflow to sort of become to accelerate. And OpenAI is having a lot of these individual conversations with different tool builders to make more narrow large language models or better specify them for very specific use cases, right? So there's the ChatGPT that we know, but there's going to be iterations of this tool moving forward. There's Midjourney, right, and DALL-E and sort of other generative AI tools that use images. But Microsoft, again, is making Copilot, which sort of uses OpenAI. And, you know, whatever else was developed during this talk, because it's a bit of a land grab. And as you can see, there's a lot of folks sort of throwing their hat into the ring, wanting to build a tool quickly in order, you know, there's the positive spin of that, which is they want to innovate and they want to sort of build a tool that is useful for folks. But there's also this aspect that we can't ignore, which is wanting to capture market share and wanting to sort of be a dominant player in the space, because it's very clear that there's going to be a lot more resources poured into this. When we're paying attention to the context, we need a sort of harkening back to Elizabeth Moji's comments during the first part of today, which is when we're interrogating generative AI, what are the digital equity concerns that are being addressed, right? Which schools adopt, which schools ban, which schools don't ban, but also don't provide training, so the tools are going to be leveraged in a way that actually is super helpful or accelerates any of the things that I mentioned in this screen when we're talking about perceived affordances. Which platforms that use generative AI or large language models are nearing ubiquity and will become ubiquitous, which will recede into the background, right? This is going to shape the context. Where does the expertise sit, right? Is it the case that a lot of the expertise is going to sit in for-profit places that tend to be very guarded about their intellectual property, right? Even bracketing whether or not that's a good or bad thing, it just is. So we need to be mindful of that. What role does the government play? Nonprofits, schools, districts, right? What are the contexts where these things are entering? And finally, thinking about the people, you all and myself, thinking about who are the prompt engineers, who are going to be the content generators, right? That actually power a lot of these our AI systems, right? We can get back to the mindfulness talk that David Yeager mentioned it, and you need content that's good to train models. And if you just open it up, it might not be super helpful. And in fact, just during the talks today, the Screen Actors Guild went on strike, or will be going on strike, because of the way their contract was written, where background performers, there was basically language in the proposed contract that said they would be scanned, and then their features could be used basically forever, right? So maybe not the stars, but if you want to enter in, first you start as a background performer, well, now maybe you're scanned and then you're not asked back again because they have your digital likeness, right? So who's generating the content, and what does it mean for folks who generate content? What are their contributions? Will people be writing by editing instead of from scratch? Will that sort of become the new norm? Who's the learner? Who's the student? Who controls the training? Who sort of holds the knowledge is an important question to ask. And finally, which folks are building the next generation of AI tools? I often, this is potentially a sort of an overstatement of the point, but when we're thinking about bias in any sort of emerging technology, I'm surprised when others are surprised that they find it, because it doesn't. Of course you do. It makes sense that if we sort of are living in sort of a society that is inherently unequal in certain segments, that the artifacts that we create will simply reflect that, right? So I think it's important to sort of move away from simply stating that and actually moving toward finding solutions for it. And this isn't sort of calling out anyone in particular. This is just a general point that I make most of the time when I'm talking about technologies, which is this idea that bias detection is sort of irrelevant. What's bias reduction look like? And it's collecting data so that tools are less biased, but it's also ensuring that the right people are in the right places to help actually build the new technologies that emerge, to build the new iterations of chatbots that are powered by ChatGPT, so that they can actually inform all these design decisions and sort of stop bias before it happens, or at least mitigate it in powerful ways. So pretty sure that's the last slide it is. That's it for me. Thank you, Mark, and the Digital Learning Lab and UC Irvine for having me, and the Spencer Foundation. I'm happy to answer some questions.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Appreciate it. So we have a question from Sean, who I think probably stands in for a lot of our K-12 folks, especially. I am still deeply in need of ways to have confidence that when one of my high school freshmen turns in an essay, I'm grading something real that comes from the mind and skill of a young writer. Despite all the exciting possibilities, I need to hear more about how to prevent it from short-circuiting my students' learning processes. How specifically do I change my assignments to discourage the misuse of AI? Stephen, do you have any thoughts? And then I'll ask Mark for some.
Sure. It's sort of with any sort of new tool that's developed, I think one of the, and you see bad use cases or potential bad use cases, the inclination is to hide it from students or hide it from people who could misuse it, as opposed to have an open and frank discussion about what it is and what it's for and what it can do. So I would say that and, I'm a former educator myself. I taught middle school for a number of years. So, in this environment, I would have an open discussion with my students and actually create assignments that use ChatGPT. And if I really want to know how my students are writing, I can still use a timed essay, and I can still actually see how they're writing sort of in 20-minute block on paper, right? If that's my concern. But if I'm instead interested in actually creating writers that are working with the technology, then having an open discussion about that and trying to get students to think about what I've said in this talk. What are the perceived affordances of ChatGPT? How are they using it? And I suspect that students will come to the same conclusions. If I over rely on this, I'll never become a good writer because I need to write from scratch sometimes. I think we need to have faith in some of our students.
And I think one of the things we're making sure we build into our curriculum is, I feel like we can tell them all day long about some of the shortcomings of it, but I want them to experience some of those shortcomings. I want them to feel it, hallucinate. I want them to know something more than the AI and realize they got it wrong. And I think that will help them be better users too. Mark, how about you? You're muted. Yeah.
I don't have a good answer to that, but I want to express my sympathy in a deeply personal way. I'm the father of twins who are rising seniors, and they took AP Lang this past year with a brilliant instructor at University High in Irvine named Christine King, and she may be in this conference because I know she's followed this stuff with interest, but she is one of the most remarkable teachers I've ever known. And she had, and both of my twins were in that class, and they learned rhetorical strategies and writing strategies and had this deep dive into writing that I didn't get until I was a graduate student. And that was such an important developmental experience for their life. And this gets back into some of the contradictions, that Stephen was talking about. I would be very disappointed. And the interesting thing is, they personally know a lot about ChatGPT because I've talked about it a lot, but they've never shown much interest in using it in relationship to their classes. And maybe that's just who they are. Maybe because Christine is such a brilliant teacher that, but I just want to say, I see a lot to be gained. I go back to what I was talking before about the Korean scientist who, having studied chemistry in Korea all the way through university, will never be a native-like writer in English. To the experience of my own kids, what they got out of a writing that was shielded from this. So I don't have the answers in terms of how to introduce this in a way that amplifies the learning experience rather than shortcoming it, than cutting it short. That's something that we're all trying to learn from. I think I have more ideas how to do that in college and graduate school. I have, in K-12 education, I think some of the ideas that Tim expressed about people, teachers using it rather than students using it themselves, but ways to start to introduce students to using it, or even to combat, maybe combat's the wrong word, but even to think critically about how students could use it in unproductive ways. I don't pretend to have the answers. I just want to express a lot of sympathy with the questioner. You're muted, Tamara.
Thank you. I was going to say that's a great way to wrap up today, on the note of, this is the beginning of a conversation, not the end. And we do need to be able to bring the research and the feet in the street all together to attack this challenging opportunity. As I said, if you missed any of today's presentations, we will be posting them on our website, pensandpixels.org. We have a lot of other resources on AI and education there, and our Discord channel will remain open as well. So we really do hope to continue this conversation with everyone, and thank all of you for participating and all of our speakers. And Stephen, thank you for closing us out today. Have a great night.